The COVID-19 pandemic has ushered in a new normal of remote work for businesses. On this video, Agile practitioners and experts from Impact Makers and Virginia Credit Union will share best practices on how to keep Agile project teams productive and thriving despite not being co-located. On our panel today from Virginia Credit Union is Frank Macrina and Shaun Ryan, and from Impact Makers are Meinweiser, Karen Akens, and Brendan King.
And I will pose my first question to Shaun. So Shaun, what are some of the key challenges you have encountered with working with remote resources and teams, and how did you overcome those challenges?
So here at the credit union, the big challenge for us is we actually don't have a work from home policy prior to this. There was the occasional, if someone was sick, we would have them work from home, or if there's an inclement weather day. But it was, in general, the things that come naturally in a day-to-day environment, the conversations, the meetings. How do you replicate that when you put a little distance behind the people? That was the challenge that we were facing, is first looking at what is the value we get out of meetings at work? What are the things we still need to do for our day-to-day? And then how can we allocate the right tools and resources to ensure we can be successful in those? So it was a big jump for us in general, just aligning tools, aligning processes, understanding this is a new normal for time to time, and how can we actually go forward with this? So the challenge in general for us was figuring it all out. It's a first for us, and so it was a lot of partnership with IT and the different organizations, understanding how we could be successful when having a full remote work environment for our teams. From the Agile team side, we very quickly looked at how we could get these teams working efficiently. All of them, fortunately, had laptops, could work from home, had the tools to do their job. It was more than aligning the tools so that we could still have stand-up, still have planning sessions, a lot of those, and putting the tools in place to facilitate the things that we could do easily within the team room, now that everyone's in their own living room or their own, bedroom, wherever they're working from. So it was establishing these best practices, just like we let teams establish norms when they're working in a team room. We empower the Scrum Master and product owner to work with the teams to be able to set up how are we going to still facilitate these meetings, what do we want to use. Myself and a couple others actually have worked for other organizations that have had either a portion of the workforce or entire organization overseas or in a different location. So we started sending out best practices when using a video conferencing tool, when using other tools like chat tools and everything else. So we started sharing best practices and learnings, and then empowering the teams and listening to them for their feedback on what was working and what they needed help with.
Outstanding, and I love the fact your mention of team norms was particularly kind of compelling with me. Obviously team norms are certainly a best practice as you're executing within the Agile frameworks and within teams, and I think you highlighted that well, Shaun. They become even more imperative as the dynamic of the team shifts to a remote workspace and as those challenges are created. That's great. That's great. Karen, anything in particular as relates to your experience in this space and some of the challenges that you've encountered with remote teams?
Well, I have just a slightly different experience because the Agile team that I was working with at a particular client always had a remote aspect to it, including offshore teams that were in different time zones. So that was probably the biggest challenge, is working with team members in this framework who you have never actually met and didn't always have technology capabilities like video. So the biggest challenge for me, I think, and for our team, was establishing those team norms and trying to come up with ways to make sure everyone could participate and everyone had a chance to be heard, because when you're remote and you can't see people, it's harder to even, judge just by a voice or somebody being quiet what their level of participation is.
Great point. Great point. Are any particular challenges you've experienced in this space?
Okay, I'd agree with what's already been said, and also just emphasize our value of people, right? So this is a unique situation that's happening across the world right now, and some of the challenges that you might be dealing with can tie back to the fact that you don't know what's going on at home with your employees and your team members. So some people feel greatly impacted by the current pandemic. Other times when there isn't that type of force coming into why we're working remote, we still don't know what's going on at home. We don't know which of our team members are juggling multiple responsibilities with family, with pets. We don't know who feels positively about working remote. We don't know who has a more difficult time with working remote unless we're having these conversations. So often I find when we start to realize that we're experiencing challenges, consider that we're not the only ones, or we're not the only team experiencing it. That's where talking about our way of working is so important. That's where talking about how does this work across our enterprise? Is this something that we've already dealt with as a company? Do we already have policies? Or is this a new learning experience? Is this something that might be a challenge now, but we can iterate and make improvements so that we can start to see not just more productivity, more delivery, but also how we can help our team members thrive through this time. Really, until we have those conversations, even if those conversations aren't face-to-face, we don't necessarily know that we're all in this together or how to improve the situation.
Great, and thanks, Sar. That's great insight. And you know, as we all know, with working in Agile, one of the key pillars is this idea of kind of respect for people, right? And so keeping them in the forefront and making sure that they're well taken care of and that we're understanding what their concerns and challenges are, I think is obviously imperative to you know, to being able to execute successfully in this space. So that's a great call out.
Yeah, and I know people will mention that sometimes people say over 85% of communication is nonverbal. So like Karen mentioned, we don't necessarily have the same level of communication we had before. So that's where talking with people, even if there's those pauses, even if you're not seeing their expressions and their reactions, it's so important to respect people, engage with them, and learn where we're at with it, because as we decrease our nonverbal communication, we're missing more of the message.
That's right. Great point. I wanted to talk a little bit about, we've kind of touched on some kind of key pain points. Obviously, ceremonies within Agile frameworks are important touch points for people to get together to do exactly what all of you have articulated, which is, you know, to make sure we've got that communication going, the transparency, the visibility to the work, et cetera. Obviously, executing against those ceremonies within a remote work setting can be challenging, as you've alluded to. So, question for Frank: as we think about kind of some of the ceremony logistics, what are some kind of logistical items that you've seen that we really need to account for to make sure that we execute well within kind of a remote work setting, and that we're prepared to really get the most out of these ceremonies?
Yeah, I think some of the basics, and thanks for having me on, Brendan, like using IM. We find that's a great tool that we inject just to prevent crosstalk and keep the conversation going. I think also having the agenda sent out in advance is another great tool so people can prepare, and then emailing the artifacts as well.
Fantastic. Absolutely agree. And I imagine, you know, as we make this shift, there may be some challenges with actually really being crisp against those things. So are there things as a leader that you've seen maybe needing to do, just behaviors reinforcement, things like that as you're going through it, or are you picking up the lessons learned along the way and then kind of reinforcing behavior?
Yeah, I think this is new for everybody, so we're just kind of picking it up as we go. But even just some basics of staying in constant communication with the team members, even just being proactive, reaching out every day, even simple little things like little games to kind of keep people connected, because we're losing that co-located feel that we've had where everybody's working together. So just ways to personalize and build that team. One of the challenges we've done recently is you know, pick the 8th photo back in your phone and send it out. Tell a little bit about what it was when that picture was taken, and we're just really finding that's just uplifting spirits, keeping everybody engaged, and building that camaraderie that's been missing as we work remote.
Yeah, it really, I like what you said there too, Frank, like that aspect of needing to reinforce creativity in the approach, and it can really be beneficial, because I think sometimes when we take for granted the interactions and we're face to face, and even as you know, you've executed these frameworks for some time, the practices themselves can become stale to a degree where they become routine, and you start missing some of some of what you're trying to get out of them, some of the real benefits they provide. And so some of the challenges that we're now faced with, I think, help us to force us back into that space of saying, you know, of leveraging lessons learned and identifying, hey, where did things work well and where didn't they? And actually, you know, my hope is that ultimately, when, you know, if the landscape does shift back, we'll carry some of those practices forward that we may not have actually gotten to had we not been forced to really think about how we were approaching things.
Yeah, and I would say recently our credit union was just really tested because we'd only done one big room planning before, where we were all together in a space, and the feedback we got is we wanted a bigger room. So we made a joke is now that, well, now you have no room because we're all doing it remotely in Q2. So, which was, you know, we were thrown into it. And as Shaun had mentioned, we hadn't really worked remote. Most of us work out of our headquarters. But, you know, the teams really pulled together. We did our homework. Our PMs do a really good job of meeting weekly, planning out the work, understanding what we need to tackle in a quarter, but simple things like rehearsing before we actually gave the presentation. We learned we had a lot of animation in our PowerPoint, and that
Sure.
didn't work. So we made a lightweight deck via PDF. We use interactive boards such as LeanKit and Trello, and set up a ton of bridge lines, and it really went off without a hitch. We were very impressed in how well the teams came together and did the planning session remotely. I know Shaun can touch more on that.
Well, like I said, that's a good lead in, Shaun. Why don't we, you know, as relates to some of those logistics, Frank and I covered a lot of ground there, so hopefully we didn't steal any thunder, but, you know, as you think about this, what were some of your takeaways regarding the logistics of your recent planning?
Just to add on to what Frank said, it being our second planning and now having the additional burden of trying to figure out how to do it remote, all of us leaders came together and understood what was the value we got out of our first planning session, what were our lessons learned from that, and how can we incorporate some of that even remote. And so we over-planned everything because we needed to. We took on the bulk of it. We got out ahead of time. Even the little learnings, like when using a video chat, if you schedule it in a calendar, you lose some flexibility on starting and stopping and when people get locked out, versus just creating a team room, which is just a link that can be open and closed at any time and won't lock people out. So we did our homework, all the little things, and we spelled it out. We took screenshots of getting into each system, what the people would see, and we got it out ahead of time and had our Scrum Masters practice with the team so they understood how to get into the channels and out. And then, like Frank said, our products and channels group did a great job of understanding how we were going to make this run smooth, how the presentation was going to run smooth, how we could hand it off from one person to the other without causing lag for people in remote areas. Just a lot of planning, and then a lot of listening to the feedback as to what was working through this. Frank alluded to the fact that we realized that animations were a no-go. It was not working with the connections. And a lot of these things, which look great and in office would have been great, weren't going to work, so we had to adjust on the fly. And so all those practices and dry runs really helped. I have to give a shout out to Frank because in the last hour, he came up with a top 10 list on why remote planning was better. And we just embraced the silliness. You know, you can be in your PJs, all the different things. And we kind of embraced it with the team. So everyone kind of.
As we get remote, that's another layer of complexity that gets added to it. So I would say preparation is very important. If you're someone in a leadership role or someone who's serving the team, I think that's even more important to facilitate. If you're a team member, it's also important to be aware of what you're going into. So that's where I encourage any preparation you can do in advance helps, whether that's for team ceremonies or whether you're talking about a larger scale PI planning. Preparation is key. So that can be reminding your teams things that maybe in the office, in conversation in passing, you would mention, or maybe you didn't need to mention it at all because we weren't in a situation where we needed as many reminders. So it's not micromanaging, but instead, how do we empower our teams, our executives, our company overall to have the right information we need to get the job done? That can be like reminding people to update their stories. It can be creating all the Skype bridges you need for a large day of PI planning. It can be being aware of what tools you have or the limitation of your tools. if you're going into a ceremony thinking that you're going to do face-to-face through video conferencing, but to save bandwidth, your company's turned off Skype video, you're going to be at a disadvantage than if you had done a trial run and learned that in advance.
Have, particularly for Frank and Shaun, have you guys, in your recent planning, did you feel like folks were maybe even more prepared than normal relative to the prior planning, just either because of experience or because they knew they had to be, or are folks still kind of adjusting?
I would say, as a credit to Frank's organization, Products and Channels, they were much more prepared than usual. They had to be willing to know each other's backlog at a high level, because if our main session broke down, the backup plan was us to break up into just the team rooms, and then the responsibility was on that product manager to understand and be able to talk to all the backlog and what was going to affect the team. So they had a lot of preparation sessions. They understood what the value we're trying to deliver over this next quarter was, and what the priority was, so they could talk to it enough that they could get the team started, and then we could pull the PMs into the other team rooms as needed. But I would say overwhelmingly, we all realized this was going to be a challenge. So we all got to work and put in a lot of work ahead of time so that the teams would have an efficient day. The last thing we wanted was it to be a waste of everyone's time.
Okay.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. I would add to that. Our teams have been really working at putting a tool together, and they use it every quarter, where we break down the work, we identify what work is active and ready for the teams to work. We balance that against our strategic plan. Where is the value of this work to the strategy? We also have 4 pillars of value. How's it helping our member value, our financial value, operational? And then we try to look at cross-team impacts. And we score all of that out. And probably 2 weeks before we get to big room planning, and this is probably not new to anybody, but then we have our sequence list, and we debate which one rises to the top, what's the most important, and we bounce that against our strategy steering committee, just to make sure we have consensus and buy-in. And that's what we bring to our big room planning session. And so we're all aligned. We've done the work, and the PMs can talk to the POs and the teams themselves and prioritize and plan each iteration. And then it's Groundhog Day. It all starts all over again. It's a grind, but it's turning out to be very, very effective. And we've started to weave in other areas of our organization, like IT. And we're looking how we can even expand it even farther than that, with maybe even enterprise projects.
Outstanding. Great. Lots of great things happening. That's good to hear. Whether you're remote or otherwise, just that pre-planning sounds like it's going really well, which is awesome. But what are some challenges maybe that you experience or that you've experienced as organizations and individuals are using more tools and technology? What are some of the gotchas as far as being able to use those effectively or not misuse them?
I think one is first making sure everybody understands the tools. We have, there are so many different tools out there. The last organization I was in, we were using Jira, for example, and there were people who'd used it for years. There were people who'd never used it. And it was making sure that everybody understood how to use the tool. And oftentimes that meant me just scheduling, as a Scrum Master, scheduling a separate session just on using the tool, or covering that in part of our core hours. Because inevitably you'd be in the middle of a stand-up and I didn't move my story because I didn't know how to make this status change, and I don't want to waste everybody's time doing that, but spending the time offline training everybody and being able to answer questions was really helpful. The other thing I wanted to point out was using tools. Again, I think you guys mentioned, finding out the animated PowerPoints didn't work really well with low bandwidth, but even when you don't have animation, things fail, and doing things like sending those presentations in advance, sending them in PDF format so that if somebody's video goes down, they can stay right in step with you. That to me was a big lesson learned the first few times we were trying to work remote with offshore teams, where I thought they had access to particular document repositories and they didn't. So just making sure that all the tools are actually available for everybody on your team is another important point.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I love what you referenced too, Karen, like have a backup to your backup and maybe a backup to that, right? Because
Yeah.
there's always, it helps to ensure that, that flow is continued within the meeting, and, you might have a brief interruption, but it doesn't come to a hard stop.
I just want to say kudos to Frank and Shaun. Listening to you guys, having gone through just your second PI planning and being so well prepared. Brendan and I were working with an organization that was getting ready to go into their fifth planning and are still learning some of these, hard-learned lessons about prep in advance. Although I have to say we would have been much better prepared to do this fifth planning session, just because everybody appreciates. They came out of it in our retrospective from the last two PI plannings and said, wow, when we plan in advance, it really works. It makes things go a lot smoother. It helps when we understand each other's backlogs and know what the other team is working on.
I guess the final question I have for the panel, and I'd love to get everybody's perspective on this, is just, if you had to pick a couple of lessons learned in reference to operating in a remote environment using Agile, what would those items be? And I think we've touched on a lot of really good ones, so don't hesitate to kind of resurface those. But I'll start with Karen.
I think my biggest lesson is iterate, and if something's not working, don't be afraid to change it. Don't be married to something that you think should be, the one go-to. Is be able to, be agile and be able to change something that you see isn't working.
Outstanding. How about you, Shaun?
I will reiterate a lot of what everyone has said. You need to have that flexibility, understand that the world's changing and you might have the best plan in the world, but have backups because things will change. You will run into challenges. Keep it as simple as you possibly can. Try to remove the complexity and just really get at the meat of what you're trying to accomplish, and constantly solicit feedback. Use retrospectives, use those opportunities to really hear from your people what is working and what is a challenge, and see if we can address them, see if we can't find a way around some of these barriers that we're facing right now.
I want to thank all of our panel members for sharing their experience today. I'm sure that those viewing this video are finding this valuable, as we've all said, as we move into this new space. And just to reiterate that idea of, sharing those experiences, those learnings, we very much appreciate everyone's time. At Impact Makers, we're passionate about helping businesses through these unprecedented times. And once again, we love sharing our experiences on these best practices through the panel or through other forums. So feel free to contact me or any of us to talk more about what you've heard on this video. So until next time, thanks again to our panel members, and have a safe and wonderful day. Thank you.